I was recently looking at the Humane AI Pen website and noticed this really cool custom scroll bar, which is made of multiple mini scroll bars for each section. Today, we're going to recreate this using fair motion layout animations, which makes this surprisingly easy. Here's a quick demo using a much simpler website with a few different sections. If you want to follow along, the starter code is linked below, and with that, let's jump in. Here we have the starter code for this project, created using next.js and styled with Tailwind. There's a hero section with an image, and then I've created some very bare bones sections. A couple of things I wanted to call out in the starter code. So one is I've already gone ahead and defined a simple data structure for each of the sections and also the actual initial data itself, all in this section data.ts file in the utils folder. I've also gone ahead and brought in this section data already, got it imported at the top, the sections from the section data, and I'm already inputting the section information, in this case, just the title in these section tags. So with that basic structure out of the way, let's jump into implementing the scroll bar. We'll need a way to track which section is active and currently on screen. We'll use React context to set up the infrastructure to store and update this global state. Let's go ahead and create a new file to define this context. I'll do it in this utils folder. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to define the data type for the data and state that we'll be storing here. There's a couple of things we need to store. One is what's the active section, and two, what is the progress of that section. So here I'll just define a type. I'll call it section context type. I will set up these properties. So for example, what is the active section? And this will be of just type number. I will also keep in state the setter for this variable. So this will be a function that just takes a number and doesn't return anything. And then similarly, I'm also going to track the section progress. So active section progress, which will also be a number. And again, I will track the setter as well here. Again, be a function that takes a number and doesn't return anything. Now let's go ahead and create a context that uses this data type. So I'm going to go in here and define and export a variable called section context. And this will be create context from React. And the type stored in this context will be the type we just defined, or it could be null as well. And this will just be for the initial case where we'll set it to null initially before anything is set. Let's create a custom hook for setting up these state variables initially. So here I'll call it a use section context values hook. And this is just so we can abstract it away from the page itself. So here I will set up a state, active section, set active section. This will be use state. And originally this will be just 0, the initial section. I'll set up another variable for the section progress, set active section progress. And again, this will also be initially value 0. And I'll simply then return here an object that has a property of values, and we'll return active section, set active section progress, and set active section progress. Okay, now with this context and hook set up, let's go ahead and integrate this context into our page so we can actually start using it. So let me go into the index file. And here at the top of this component, let me first bring in the hook, use section context values that we just created. And this will have a object that returns name values that we just defined. And these are the values that we're pulling in from the context. And then we can simply just wrap everything underneath this main tag in a section context.provider. And the value here that this context is taking in is this values that we set up with this hook. And let's just put the end tag as well. And now with all that set up, we now have access to this context. We have passed it an initial set of values here that we've configured in this hook. And now everything in this page has access to the context. So now with all this infrastructure set up, let's go ahead and start actually populating and updating the data in this context. So what we need to do is for each section here that we have, we need to track its own scroll progress to pass up to the context and broadcast its state so that other components like the custom scroll bar, which will be an independent component, has access essentially to that data. So for this, I'm going to create a section component and do all that tracking in there. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to create a new folder called components. And I'm going to create a section.tsx file, create a new React component. So the first thing I'm going to set up is the property definition that we want for this component based on the data that we're going to need here in a little bit. So I'm going to set up an interface called section props, and this is going to extend HTML attributes. So we have access to all the normal HTML properties, and this will have a generic type of HTML element. And the properties we want, well, we want to know what is the actual section. And in this case, this will be of type section here. And so this, remember, this section data type has both data on the ID of the section as well as the content, in this case, just the title. I'm also going to go ahead and add a couple of optional properties for is first, which would be a Boolean, and is last. And we'll see this come in handy when we start thinking about the scroll tracking. Okay, let's now move to setting up some of the very basic JSX that we'll put in this section. So here I'll return a section tag. And in the section tag, I will say if there's any children in this section, then I will return the children tags that are passed in. Otherwise, I will just set up a very simple div, and this div will have an h1, and it will just take the title and display it. And this is giving some errors right now because it doesn't know what children in the section are because we haven't tied this property definition to this component. So let's do that. So this section is of type, it's a React functional component, and it takes the section props in. And then let's go ahead and destructure the props. So we have section is first, and if it's not given a value, by default, we'll give it a value of false. Same thing for is last. I'll explicitly get access to the children here, and I can do that because it extends HTML attributes. And then finally, it will just absorb all the remaining props as well. And then I'm just going to take these props and actually just pass them directly into the section tag. So any other stuff that gets passed in will just get passed through directly to the section. Now I'm going to add some very light styling here on the div and the h1. So on this div, go give it a width of full, flex, justified center, and a padding top of 20. And on this h1, I'm going to give it a text 6 pixel and font semi-bold. Okay, so now with this basic setup configured, let's go ahead and pull in the section context that we set up. So here in the component above the return statement, I'm going to first get the section context that we are nested in. So const section context, and now say use context from React, and I'll use the section context. And then here at the top, I'll simply say if section context is null, then I'll just return out here. This shouldn't be the case because we are wrapped in this section context provider, but because by default use context, as you can see, can return null from the use context hook. So we have to handle that case. So now that we have the section context pulled in, we can pull out some specific properties from the context. So in this case, I'm going to pull out set active section and set active section progress that we had set up earlier. And this will just be coming from section context. So now we have the ability to update the state stored in the context using these setters. So now let's go ahead and actually calculate the values that we want to set up into the section context. So for this, we're going to have to set up scroll tracking for this section, and we're going to use the use scroll hook from Framer Motion to help with that. So for this, we first need to grab a reference to what we're trying to track the scrolling of, in this case, this section tag. So here I'm going to say const container is use ref, and by default, this ref will be null. Let me import use ref, and I'll attach this container ref to the tag down here. So now that's set up. Then I will pull out the scroll y progress value from use scroll. And use scroll will take some properties to set this up. So it needs to take a target. In this case, it will just be the container ref that we just set up. And then we also need to tell it an offset. Now, this is used for telling the use scroll hook essentially how do you want to define 0% progress and 100% progress of scroll. So by default, we are going to say we want 0% to be when the start of the container is in the center of the screen. And we want the 100% to be when the end of the container is at the center of the screen. it turns out that for the first and last section, this definition becomes sort of weird because let's say you're in the first section here at the top, when the page loads, the start of the section is well past the center of the screen. It's at the top of the screen. So it's going to start with a value of 50%. And similarly at the end, this end center also won't make sense because the end of this container at the bottom won't go past the end of the screen. So you will never get to 100% on this last section. So to fix this, what we're going to do is set up slightly different configurations of offset if we know that it's the first or the last section. So here, instead, I'm just going to say if is first, then we'll set a start, and center configuration for offset. Else, if last, then we'll set a start, center, and end configuration. And else, we'll use the default configuration that we have set up here. All right, so now we have scroll tracking set up. So now we just need to push these values as they update to the section context. For this, we're going to use a motion value event to track when this scroll Y progress value changes. And every time it changes, then we will broadcast the latest value to the context. So here I'm going to say use motion value event, and this will be an event attached to scroll Y progress. We're going to track the change event. And what we want happen is it will take the value and I'll say, if the value is greater than 0 and it's less than 1, so if it's between 0 and 1, then we'll actually go ahead and update to the context. So we'll say, set the active section to be section.positionID, so the current section's ID, and we'll set the active section progress to the value of scroll Y progress. And the reason why we're checking between 0 and 1 here is because if the value is outside these bounds, that means that effectively the section is off screen. And so that's why we wait until we know it's between 0 and 1, it's on the screen, and then we say, okay, this is an active section, and here's, by the way, the progress of that section. So now that we have this new section component all set up, let's go ahead and use it in the index file. So I'm going to replace each of these section tags with our new section component, including this first section with this image. Now, because of the way that we set this up, we can actually do a pretty much one-for-one swap here of the component because, remember, we set this up in such a way that the properties extend a basic HTML attribute set. Now, getting an error here that the property of section is missing. So let's go ahead and add that. So say section is simply sections 0. So remember, this is the section data that we have pre-configured. And we also need to tell this section that it is the first one in the list, so it has the appropriate tracking. Okay, now let's go ahead and replace the other sections down here. So I'm going to just copy this and replace all these tags. And now I just need to pass a section property to get the right data. So this will be sections 1. Let me just copy this. This will be sections 2. And this will be sections 3. And I'm just going to remove the actual content here as well so that the default div that we had set up just comes through instead. So now when I hit save, nothing actually really changed on the left. If I scroll down, you will notice now that our stylings have come through now. So now this looks a little bit better than it was before. But other than that, everything else is pretty much the same. So now that we have these new sections all set up and put in, let's now go ahead and create the actual scroll bar itself. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new component here. And I'm going to call it scrollbar.tsx. Create a new React component. And like before, let's first start by setting up the component properties that are going to be passed in. So I'm going to define an interface called scrollbar props. And here it's going to be pretty simple. It is simply going to take one property called sections, and this will just be a type, an array of sections. And let's import this data type. And this, you have to be careful, is from section data, not the actual section component. Now let's attach this property definition to the component. So scrollbar is a React functional component that takes these properties that we just defined. And then let's just go ahead and destructure the section's value from the properties. Now inside of this component, let's go ahead and access the section context and get access to the variable stored there. So I'll say const section context equals use context, and this will use the section context. And again, like before, we need to confirm that this context is not null. So for this, null, we'll just go ahead and return out the component. But then now we know that it's not null, so we can pull out the values of active section and active section progress from the section context. Now let's go ahead and set up the visuals of the scroll bar. So here I'll return a div, and inside this div, I'm going to map over the sections that we have passed in. So sections.map. Here, the input value will be of type section, but in this case, I only care about the ID of the section, not the rest of the data. So I'm just going to explicitly extract out the position ID. And what we're going to do here is for these sections, we're going to generate a list of dots that effectively represent the sections. So for that, I'm going to use a div, and let's go ahead and style this div to make it look like a dot. So here I'm going to say width of 2, height of 2, and overflow hidden. And for now, I'll give it a background of, let's just say, slate 400. Now let's get this scroll bar just showing up here on the screen so we can actually start to see it. So just here in the index file, right above this first section, I'm going to go ahead and pull in scroll bar. And let me just pass in these sections here from our sections data. Okay, go ahead and hit save. And we have this interesting object here in the top left. This is the list of dots. So let's go ahead and add some styling here also to move it to the right-hand side. So in this overall div of the scroll bar, I'll give it some more class names. So I'm going to give it a position of fixed. I'm going to give it a right 10. So this will position it, in this case, 40 pixels from the right of the screen. Go ahead and give it a height of screen, flex call, gap 2, justify, center, and a Z of 10. The other thing I'll just go ahead and do as well is to make them not squares, but circles, is here in the div, I'll just add a rounded of full, and this will make them into dots. Now we want to set up dynamic colors first for these dots based on whether a section is active or not. So in this case, what we're going to do is instead of setting dynamic styling in Tailwind, because that gets very messy, we're going to directly use the style attribute on this div to set up the dynamic background color. So here in this div, I will use the style attribute. And in this style attribute, I'll use the background color property. And here I'll say if the active section, right, which we've gotten from the section context, is equal to the position ID of the section that this dot represents, this dot should be active. So here I will return an RGB value of 200, 200, 200. Else, if it's not active, I'll return a RGB of 82, 82, 82. And let me go ahead and get rid of this background slate. So now when I hit save, you can see that we have this dot here. The first dot is a lighter shade of gray, and the rest of the dots are a different color because this first section is active. As I scroll, we'll watch as this line gets to the middle of the screen. There we go. Now the second dot is changed color. Now it's the third dot, and now it's the fourth dot. So we have this basic tracking set up. Now let's go ahead and set up the height of each of these dots. Because remember, when we have a section that's active, we actually need this dot to be a pill because we need it to become a mini scroll bar for this section. So for this, in addition to setting up dynamic background colors, I'll also set up dynamic heights of these dots. So here I'll say height, and we'll say if the active section is equal to this position ID. So if we're working with the active section, then I want this height to be 32 pixels, else 8 pixels. Now when I hit save, there we go. We now have a longer pill here for the active section. And just for consistency, let me just remove this Tailwind utility for the height. And now as I scroll, there we go. So we have now changing color, and we have changing size of the indicator as well. So next, what we want to do is we want this transition between these two sections to be a little bit nicer than what we have right now, just jumping from one to another. And for that, we're going to use layout animations that Framer Motion gives us. We need to first convert this components div into a motion component. Let me import motion from Framer Motion. And then next, let me also convert the divs here as well to be motion divs. So let me just copy this. And now inside of this motion div, we need to simply pass in the layout property. And this is what enables layout animations Now let's go ahead and just try this. So I hit save, and now if I scroll, and you'll notice right now the animations don't actually really seem to be working. And this is because the other thing we need to do for layout animations is we need to pass in a key value, which in this case, I'll just give it position ID for each dot, because this is what allows for motion to track these different objects as they change properties so that it can properly animate the state from one to another. So now if I scroll, yeah, you can see like it has an interesting, it's animating, but the animation is not ideal right now. And there's a couple reasons why. So the first thing we need to do is we need to remove rounded full from the class name. And this is because layout animations in firmware motion are actually known to not work well with border radii. There's a reason why, because of the way it's implemented. So instead of doing rounded full in the styling in the tailwind, I'm going to manually go in here in style and set border radius to be a really high value, in this case, like 9999. So that's the first thing I'll do. The second thing I'll do is I'm also going to set up a transition value here. So we'll tell it, in this case, how long we want this layout transition to occur. In this case, I'll set the duration to be 0.3. So now if we try again, and if I scroll, there we go. Now it looks a lot better than it was before, and you don't have that weird morphing that was going on previously. The next thing that we need to do is we need to set up the mini scroll progress indicators as we progress within a section. So for that, I'm going to go inside of this div here, and we're going to set up a second div that represents that mini progress bar. We only want to show this if the section is active. So we'll say active section equals position ID. If that's the case, then we will return some JSX. So in this case, we'll return a div, and this will be a self-closing div here. And for this div, it'll have some class names, width full, and I'll give it a BG of yellow 400. And now what we need to do is we need to set up the height of this to be dynamically set based on the active section progress value that we got from the section context. So for this, again, we're going to use framer motion and treat this as a dynamic style that gets changed over time. So here I'll say this will be a motion div. And in this motion div, again, we'll set the style property. And here I'll set the height as a string literal, and it will say calc, and then we pass in some JS, active section progress times 100. And then outside of this, we'll put a %. Now when I hit save, and now as I scroll, there you go. We see that this yellow scroll bar tied to the scroll progress all the way from 0 to 100. And then when we switch, it nicely animates to this next section. Scroll bar starts again. We keep scrolling. It shifts, it keeps going, and it shifts. And one thing we'll notice actually here is that this scroll bar is not fully filling up all the way. This is because we forgot to tell the section that is the last section. So I'm going to go here and say, you are the last section. And now when I hit save, it properly goes back to 100. Now, as a final touch to this, you'll notice that as we scroll, we still have the browser default scroll bar here on the right, which kind of is not needed anymore that we have this custom scroll bar. So let's go ahead and just hide this scroll bar using CSS. So I'm just going to go into the global CSS file. And in here, I'm going to say on the HTML, I'll say overflow scroll. And then I'll have a tag for the WebKit scroll bar. And here I'll just say width 0 pixels, height 0 pixels, and background transparent. And so now when I hit save, the scroll bar has disappeared. So now we just have our custom scroll bar here and no more default scroll bar. With that, we finished creating this custom scroll bar. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments below. And on screen now is another video for you to check out, and I'll see you in the next video.